Okay, my name is David Harvey, and I direct the Center for Place, Culture and Politics here at the CUNY Graduate Center. It's a great opportunity for us to have Raquel Rolnik here once more to talk on some of the housing questions. But I think I should turn this over to Rob Robinson, who's going to actually tell you about the details of organization. Okay, Rob.
Thank you. Just go past it. Just put me. So thank you and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again, David. I want to thank everybody at the center, at the Grad Center, for their support in putting this event together, especially Peter Harris and the folks in the audiovisual services, and his staff. Cecilia was great to me, and I want to thank you. And David, for folks who don't know, has always been accommodating to me and has really opened up the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics to the work that I do and embracing the work that I do in a real way. But I think, you know, for every David there's always somebody behind the scenes that doesn't get the accolades that they're supposed to. And in this case, that's Padmini Biswas, who, big hand for Padmini. Padmini is one of those people that I drive crazy with emails on a regular basis, asking for stuff. She's always responsive, always there for me. And when I really knew I had a special place with Padmini was the other night. We were emailing back and forth, and she was going back and forth with me like 11:30 at night, and I said, okay, really cool, Padmini is into this. So thank you, Padmini Biswas. As you know, this is being streamed, live streamed across the world, and I want to just say hello to a few groups that are picking up this live stream: the International Alliance of Inhabitants, the European Squatters Collective, Avaros Mendenke, which is a homeless organization that I had the pleasure of being a part of, seeing it nurture itself in Budapest, Hungary, and two of their members are in the audience today, Eva Tessa Udavardelli and Belen Vocetek are both here. Could you stand up, please? Because these are folks that I take a lot of pride in, and you hear me talk a lot about Budapest and my relationship to Budapest. We love Budapest. The Abahali movement in South Africa, Menkelo Mazwi Zodwa, hello from New York City. Thank you. And you truly inspire us all from Budapest and the Shack Dwellers movement, so I love what you do and want to continue the relationship. And they were just here, as many of you know, on the Dear Mandela tour, and I want to connect with them in a real way, so we're figuring out how they can share what they've learned via Skype, so I'm looking forward to that. And then finally on an international level, I want to thank UN Special Rapporteur Raquel Rolnik and her staff, especially Marianne in her office, who is another individual that's just always responsive, chats me whatever I need, connecting me from here to Geneva. So Marianne, if you're listening, thank you for everything you do, and God bless you. Thank you. I want to say hello in the United States to the Los Angeles Community Action Network. Hello to Mayday New Orleans. Hello to the Oglala Sioux Nation, Pine Ridge in South Dakota. All the members of the Western Regional Advocacy Project, the USA-Canada Alliance of Inhabitants, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and Picture the Homeless here in New York. Hello to all of you. Not to be forgotten, a big hello to Rula Awad Rafferty and all the members of the Moscow, Idaho Human Rights Commission. A big hello from New York City. Thank you for tuning in. For those who don't know me, my name is Rob Robinson, and I work with NESRI, which is a human rights program. And NESRI goes by the NESRI, the acronym stands for the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. And they work in partnership with communities to build a broad movement for economical, culture, social rights, including health, housing, education, and the work with dignity. And they base that on the principle that the fundamental need to create human rights obligations on the part of government and the private sector, NESRI advocates for public policies that guarantee universal, equitable fulfillment of these rights in the United States. I want to acknowledge some of the staffers of Nesri. Brittany Scott, the program associate at the Human Right to Housing program at Nesri, is here, and you'll hear from Brittany later. I want to thank Kathy Albizer and Tiffany Gardner, the former Human Right to Housing director, for making this all possible. We will be joined shortly by Tanika Lower, who is the new Human Right to Housing, incoming Human Right to Housing director at Nesri. We're joined in the audience by folks from Witness, and we have the Venerable Luan Sobath here with us. So, Venerable, please stand up and just take a couple of accolades. Please stand. That's the way we do it in New York City. Any of you that took part in the town hall meeting that we did in 2009, when the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing kicked off the first official mission in the U.S., you heard me say that night that the U.S. government has always taken an exceptionalist attitude with respect to human rights, constantly trying to make all the world believe that the U.S. holds itself to a higher standard than the rest of the world. The grassroots community, with allied organizations, legal advocates, academia, and others that do policy work, we found out over and over again that this wasn't true. We're not being heard in Washington, and we're not being heard in many places around the world. However, we continue to raise our voices. We organize within our communities, and we formed international alliances and networks, and we started talking global movements, and Geneva listened. Geneva listened in a real way, and we were able to have the world's leading expert on housing tour the conditions that we expose to the world. And in February 2010, Raquel Rolnik echoed our voices here in the United States. She delivered a report that had over 100 recommendations to the U.S. government. And that's when a light went on in my head, and I said, we got to organize using a human rights frame in this country. There needs to be a grassroots movement in this country where people understand they have the basic rights by virtue of being human. Human rights that protect civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of all people. A value system that needs to change. We need to go from material values in this country and move towards a communal model. What do we need as a community? What are our community's needs? We need to start thinking about things that transform us. We need a society that transforms us, a society whose single focus isn't profit. We need to be self-reflective, and we need to ask ourselves, why am I caught up in this thing called the American dream? A dream that privileges the 1% and neglects the 99% majority. A society that seems to perpetuate all the isms, classism, sexism, racism. A human rights frame that will move us into the direction that we all want to see. It will move us, it removes us from the silos of which we tend to organize in, right? We tend to say, this is my issue. I work on labor, I work on housing, I work on education. But a human rights frame will allow us to organize in a way that removes the structures that prevent us from achieving our goals of fair and equitable and a just society. A human rights frame that is mired in principles of universality. Public policies must ensure that everyone's human rights are protected and fundamental needs met, and that everyone is included. Equity means public policies must enable equality of opportunity and outcome with regard to protecting human rights and meeting human needs. Everyone contributes what they can, and everyone gets what they need. Participation policies must be accountable and ensure that participation and the power of the people. Everyone is empowered to participate and to hold public and private sectors accountable. We must ensure that public goods, and in order to meet the principles of universality, equity, and participation, we must ensure that material, economic, and social services and the goods and infrastructure necessary to realize people's basic needs meet their fundamental needs and are treated as public goods, not commodities. If we start to think in this direction, then and only then will we build a true movement for social change. When we open up spaces as a community to have the conversations about race, class, poverty, sexism and privilege and economic injustice and have conversations with all sectors of society, then and only then will we begin to build a true global movement. We will start to share resources, share knowledge, share tactics. Then and only then will we build a true movement for change. You know, the one thing I'm so proud of as I do the work and Take Back the Land, which many of you know I'm a part of, is as we develop our thinking and develop our tools for learning, we call it open source. We share it with anybody who is interested. We don't protect it. It's not guided by money. It's not directed by profit. It's out there for all the world if they want to engage in it and use it for learning. Finally, I just want to say the Occupy movement has been instrumental in re-energizing and mobilizing the masses. Community groups have been organizing the masses for years. And when those two forces make a serious attempt to join in, then and only then will we build a real movement for social change. Thank you. So folks, this Center for Place, Culture, and Politics has been a special place for me. It's a little bit difficult. It's been a second home. And one of the people interested in making it a second home was Professor Neil Smith. Always opening up his class to activists and organizers and encouraging his students to work within the community. And he was the person that made me believe in revolution and how powerful revolution is. So I just want to take a moment in the memory and have a moment of silence in the memory of Professor Neil Smith. Thank you. As we move forward, a couple of the other people that were interested in making this place a home and other institutions of learning a home are Professor Peter Marcuse, Professor Emeritus of Urban Planning at Columbia University. I've had the pleasure of working with him as part of the Right to the City Reading Group, and there was a student at the time by the name of Marnie Brady who is now a PhD candidate here at the Grad Center. I'd like the two of you to come to the stage, please. Okay. First, we'll have Marnie talking about Neil Smith and who he was, and then we'll be followed by Professor Peter Marcuse. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, and good afternoon. I am Marnie Brady, and I'm honored to help dedicate this forum to the life and work of a visionary thinker who is also a professor, an advisor, a mentor to many of us here today, myself among them, Neil Smith. So I'd like to share a few examples from my own experience to demonstrate how Neil's revolutionary voice has traveled and why it's so important that we lift up Neil's ideas and continue to project his voice in the critical realm of housing. I was first introduced to Neil's work through his book, New Urban Frontiers, better known as The Revanchist City. It was 1997, and I was an organizer in a part of Washington, D.C. that for many of my neighbors represented both a place of community and the insecurity of place, threatened by an infusion of development, immigration raids, and so-called quality of life policing. Neil's sharp and clear explanations of gentrification helped me as an organizer as I worked with others to create a map of our own changing city. Taking Neil's analysis seriously of uneven development, including paying close attention to the relationship of land and housing and the role of the state. demanded from us different organizing methods and strategies as we went about our work, our campaign to save our neighborhoods. Neil's work helped us to rethink how to link our face-to-face, building by building, housing justice work to the growing global justice movement of the late 90s. And there are but a handful of public intellectuals whose work accompanies and informs movements, and Neil was such a scholar. We came to understand the stakes of our organizing not as housing per se, but as the city, and the city as the scene of our resistance to global economic restructuring. When I came to study sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center, I learned that Neil Smith was here. And it didn't take long to find this out because students are abuzz in the early weeks of which professors would make time for talking at length with their students, which would make us feel welcome, and of which would compel us towards our highest level thinking. I signed up for Neil's first Urban Revolution class, where organizers, activists, as Rob pointed out, artists, planners, filmmakers, and graduate students packed the room vying for seats or a piece of wall to lean on. This was a class steeped in Neil's mix of genuine hospitality and revolutionary provocations. While Neil extended his students' critical understanding of the significance of space, he also created or supported spaces, so to speak, in the university to transform the university that conspired against the divides of the organic versus formal intellectual and helped dislodge disciplinary boundaries, whether at the seminar of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, the New York City Social Forum, the Right to the City Reading Group, his classes on the production of space, his now famous walks through the Lower East Side, Occupy, or last spring's Free University, Neil turned to his students as strategists to argue the big questions of what might be done to further unsettle, to unnerve, to build or defy organization, to create strategy or to risk all in the name of urban revolution. Neil, of course, had a special interest in the problem of housing. In what was to become my last email exchange and extended conversation with him, Neil asked for my reflections on Engels' The Housing Question. We debated. Where we agreed was that as of late, housing finance has become shown as integral to the very functioning of capitalism, that housing organizing, often led by women, sustains in its victories the relationships that can further build power, and that in our work in housing, we can pry open, in Neil's words, the cracks. Neil was an ally to Picture the Homeless, whose count of the number of bank-warehoused, vacant properties in this city demonstrates the ruling class's insistence on homelessness, to take back the land and their daily struggles of moving people without homes into homes without people, and to the Right to the City Alliance, as Neil is looking forward to what would be their shutdown of Fannie Mae this fall that resulted in the arrests of tenants, underwater homeowners, and homeless individuals together. Neil's revolutionary voice will continue to travel with his more than ever motivated students and the organizers he influenced and who influenced him. We will find Neil's overwhelming optimism over despair toward a radically open future. So as we take up today the questions of housing and of building a more powerful movement where housing becomes seen as a collective right, let's carry forward the kind, resolute, magnanimous voice of Neil's. Let's see in ourselves what he saw in us, the possibility of the revolutionary and life-affirming city. Thank you.
A well-known philosopher once said, one that was concerned about issues that bring us all here, that we will never ultimately achieve our goals, the kind of society Rob was talking about. We will not achieve liberation until we have overcome death. And it's a disturbing thought, and in a sense a very true one. But it's one that remembering Neil Smith and putting it in that context should remind us that what it's all about really is human beings and the life of humans, what we can do to make their life better while they're here, even if there is one thing that we cannot do for them, and that is to avoid death. I feel that very deeply with looking at Neil's picture and remembering him. And I think it's fitting that we honor him on occasion like this. I want to talk, Neil was many things. He was a writer, he was a teacher, he was a geographer, he was a houser, he was a supporter of political causes, he was active in social movements, and he was a very good friend, and he was a very nice guy. I want to come back to that at the very end, because I think that's a central aspect of humanity and of what we would want humanity to be for all of us. But in between, let me talk about one particular aspect of Neil. That is that he was an activist intellectual. That he combined two modes of thought and of action that are sometimes in tension with each other. For academics, being an activist is sometimes frowned upon, does not always bring you the kind of advancement to tenure and fame and reputation in professional circles that you would want, because it interferes with some notion of objectivity that is I think fraudulent to begin with, but that is very widely shared, and that holds back many academics who would like to be more active from doing what they really would like to do. And many activists also have some, suspicion is perhaps too strong a word, but some holding back from the full acceptance of academics as colleagues and partners in their struggles, because academics have in many ways a privileged life. They do not suffer from those ills that they would like to spend their time fighting and struggling with others that directly suffer from homelessness, from hunger, from poverty. So there is some hesitation in accepting leadership from people who are, to put it in crude terms, who are of a different class from those that are suffering from the ills of a exploitive class society. And Neil was able, it seems to me, to overcome that separation. He did it in a variety of roles that I think activist intellectuals can play, in terms of training, in terms of the education that he provided, which was open not only to academics and those in the academic field, but also to activists on the ground, grassroots activists. He was able to do it with relatively little tension among the roles. He was not only one of the roles that most easily overcomes the separation is that of a technical advisor. And he was that, but he was much more than that. He was an advisor on strategy. He was a theorist on the causes of the problems of poverty and of oppression. He was what fits most easily into the phrase that's used in the Right to the City movement, at least, and in others. He was an ally, not a member, but not removed either, not a free-floating intellectual, but one bound by the ties of an alliance to those in the front lines of the struggle. There are, it seems to me, two extreme models of what an activist intellectual might be, and forgive me for oversimplifying grossly the example that I want to use, but it would be the difference between Karl Marx and Antonio Gramsci. Karl Marx was certainly an intellectual and certainly played a major role in movements for social change, but he was not a worker. His place of work was the British Museum and Library. He went to many conferences and spoke, but clearly the intellectual predominated in what he personally did, in how he spent his time. Gramsci spoke about organic intellectuals, and I oversimplify grossly because by organic he really has two different meanings. One is arising out of the oppressed, organically being oneself oppressed or of the class that is oppressed, organic in that sense. He also meant it in the sense of identifying organically as an essential part of what the intellectual does with the struggle of other activists. But the idea that genuine activist intellectuals should have roots, their own personal roots, in the working class or in those oppressed, is closer to Gramsci than it is to Marx. And it seems to me Neil found a path between those two that got the best of both of them. I don't know what Neil's personal class background was. He came from a small town in Scotland. I don't know what his father did. Perhaps others do, and perhaps will comment. But it did not appear very often in what he talked about or what he wrote. He was simply committed in a firm alliance with those that were fighting and struggling for a better world. So it seems to me we can well see Neil Smith as the very model of an activist intellectual. And he was able to straddle these two elements in part simply because he was, as I said at the beginning, a nice guy. That he personally was friendly and open, had no condescension, had no pretensions, stuck to his guns, was perfectly willing to be provocative and combative even, but always on a human basis, on a human scale. And I'm sure that helped a great deal. So I think Neil is the very model of a modern activist intellectual, and he stands in a tradition that is ongoing in which there are many participants, some of which are here. He was the first director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. David Harvey, who's the present director, is very much in that same tradition and advancing it actively. Neil was a student of his and I think absorbed much from David. The same thing is true of Rob Robinson, whom I would also consider an activist intellectual, coming more perhaps from the Gramsci model than from the Karl Marx model, but going in the same direction. And I think it's appropriate that Nesri, with whom he's associated, would be a co-sponsor of this event together with the center. So I think the tradition is a strong one, and I think it is also well represented by Raquel Rolnik, whom we are about to hear, and it seems to me we ought to turn our attention to listen to her. Thank you.
So I just want to really thank Marnie Brady and Dr. Peter Marcuse. You really brought a touch of Neil to this audience, and I appreciate it. But I want to, for me, when I do stuff like this, it's easier if I tell stories as I go along. So I'm going to turn over the written stuff that I do because I'm not comfortable doing it. I'd rather do this from telling stories. And I'm going to, before we move on to the next part of the program, I'm going to tell a little story about Neil. And I just recently had the opportunity to travel to India. Tiffany Gardner, the former Human Right to Housing Director at Nesri, was working with some academics from around the country that she knew embarked on this trip every year. And they sent a proposal, and we were trying to raise funds to get myself and another member of the Los Angeles Community Action Network on the trip. And we were coming up a little short, and Tiffany said, well, Rob, you seem to work well with the academic community. Why don't you reach out to them? So I did my best to put together a professional email. And, I speak in a lot of the people's classes that are here, the academia that is in this room. I speak regularly in their classes, and a lot of times honorariums come with those. So I thought maybe I can do an exchange. Instead of the honorarium, maybe the school could help donate to this trip and help us get to India, right? So I put out my email one Saturday morning, right? And, lo and behold, I'm sitting in the Nesri office, and an instantaneous response comes back from Neil Smith. And he says, Rob, I'm not so sure what you're asking. It seems like you need money to make this trip to India. So I'm going like, yeah, Neil, but I don't want it to come from you. I'm hoping that you can get the grad center to donate to the trip. So we go back and forth a little bit by email. He gets some details. And I ended saying, Neil, I don't want money from you personally. I want it to come from the school. Well, 2 days later, the staff at Nesri drops an envelope on my desk. It comes from the CUNY Grad Center, and it's a $500 personal check from Neil. And I get on the phone and I call Neil and I say, Neil, I told you I didn't want a check from you. And Neil just threw up his hands and says, well, Robbie, I'm not taking it back. Give it to Take Back the Land and do something with it, but I'm not taking it back. Put it to good use. And he hung up the phone. So I'm like, well, the other part of that is, and I eventually sent it back, but I want to tell you how special Neil is. Neil is the only adult that ever got away with calling me Robbie and Bobby, and I'll tell you that in this room. I cannot stand that name, and any adult who knows me will tell you that it's a death sentence if you call me Robbie or Bobby. But ever since I knew Neil, he has always called me Robbie. So Neil was a special person. I just wanted to bring that out. So as we move forward through the rest of the program, many people have helped me get to this place standing before you here today, and one of those persons is Brittany Scott, the program associate at the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. And as Brittany came on to work with me almost 2 years ago, it was easy to see that Brittany was a great writer. And, it's something I despise. I'll stand up here and talk to people, and I'll meet people and talk to people all day long. But if you ask me to put my thoughts in writing, I don't do it. And they were trying to get me to write a blog the other day, and I danced around it. And, some people will figure out, now why he didn't write the blog, but, it's just not something I like. But, I always knew that I had a person in that Nesri office to make me feel good. So I'm going to, as we move into the next part of the program, I'm going to ask Brittany Scott to come up to the stage. And then there's another person that I'm going to ask to come up. That's Eric Tars from the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty in Washington. And Eric, some of you I met in some groups earlier as we were coming into the room. And as I did with Joanne Kumaf Ward from the Columbia Human Rights Institute, Eric was one of those people responsible for bringing me to Geneva and pushing me out in front and telling me, you need to be telling your story, you need to be talking to these delegates. And Eric and his organization, the National Law Center, has worked with myself and worked with Nesri for a long time. And they recently gave me a Personal Achievement Award. So I want to bring Brittany Scott from the National Economic Social Rights Initiative and Eric Tars from the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty up to the stage, and I want them to talk about what happened in 2009 when we got the first official visit of a UN rapporteur on the right to adequate housing.
So I think I'll kick it off for the two of us, but I wanted to start by thanking Raquel Rolnik for three things, actually. The first one is her commitment to the principle that directly affected communities are the experts of this housing crisis. And thank you. And the second one is her ability to echo the messages of the communities that she met with here in 2009 in her report, and in doing so, doing it in such a way that really clarified the interconnectedness of the very different struggles we were experiencing throughout the country, and in doing so, really showing us the enormity of the crisis that we're facing, and lastly, for being here today, 3 years after your first official historic visit. And today, 3 years later, we actually, the crisis has actually gotten worse. Let me see if I can do this. If you look at the foreclosure crisis, for one, we're talking about the numbers of households that are facing foreclosure is actually equivalent to, basically, if you took everybody in New York and they all received a foreclosure filing twice in the last 5 years, that's the number of people throughout the country who have received a foreclosure filing. And that number is supposed to double in the next 5 years, which would be a total of 1 in 5 people living in a house that is mortgaged right now experiencing that aspect of the crisis. But in addition to that, rents are rising, but are wages? No. In fact, they're declining, right? And we're experiencing widespread unemployment. And what about the public safety net? Public housing, subsidized housing. I like to sum it up with 3 words, what the trend is there, and that is starvation, privatization, and demolition. And I think that's all we need to say about that. But altogether, what this means for all of us is that we have a rising homelessness crisis, and that 1 in 3 U.S. households can't even afford their housing costs, and that puts them in this precarious situation more so than ever. And as I think Rob hinted at, right, that it's not for lack of housing, because in the U.S. we have 18.5 million vacant homes. So in 2009, when Raquel actually, she chose to come here, she wanted to come to the U.S. Because of the profound crisis here, stemming from housing being treated as a commodity and not a social good, not a fundamental human need, and a fundamental human right. And her commitment to working with communities really provided us with a unique opportunity, and I'm happy to say that we took it. And a network of 70 grassroots organizations came together to show Raquel the breadth and the depth of the crisis here in the U.S. And we set it up so that there were 6 city stops on this tour, and we made sure that it included not just urban centers, but rural and indigenous communities as well. And in each of those locations, Rob named them in the beginning of this. There was a city chair that was a grassroots organization that served as the host. And they were able to working with this network of 70 groups, made it possible for the 2,000, I think over 2,000 individuals to participate in this historic tour, providing testimony, arranging site visits, and organizing community meetings. It was a first of its kind model, I think Raquel told us, and I think that that's something that we can be proud of here. And actually, the community itself documented this historic tour, this model, through not only a shadow report that to Raquel's official report, which is available outside, but also a grassroots documentary, which is called More Than a Roof, and is also available outside. What we saw on this tour and what Raquel saw was that this crisis has more than one face, that it traverses geographical boundaries, racial boundaries, and even economic boundaries today, and that our disparate struggles that we're facing in all these different locations are actually extraordinarily interconnected, and that the roots we share. So when she went to Chicago, she saw the devastation that was wrought by the wrecking ball that HUD sent to destroy the public housing, or to demolish, which is destroy, the public housing, our permanently affordable housing stock there. And in LA, she saw 50,000 people sleeping in a concentrated part of downtown LA, sleeping on the streets. And then when she went to South Dakota, to Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, she saw 2 to 3 families, I think something like 17 people, living in a 1-bedroom trailer that was infested with a deadly black mold. Altogether, this tour that was facilitated by this amazing network of grassroots groups coming together really illustrated the vast failure of our housing system to ensure adequate housing for all. And it also, this tour was a model of consultation, and it allowed Raquel to echo, which is our favorite thing that you've said, since I think Rob said it too, but to echo the messages of the community. And if only our elected officials would adopt this approach. I don't think Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign is in the room yet. They were one of our city chairs, but I know they're coming, and they would remember this story, and perhaps others do too. But when HUD announced under the current administration that they were going to have a consultation process, because they had a public housing reform initiative, that they invited public housing residents to participate in, and when we really quite quickly learned that it was a bit of a PR stunt to deliver to sell an idea to residents, to those who were directly affected by these decisions that were predetermined. And so we actually found ourselves outside HUD offices flyering about the consultation process that was taking place inside. So, if only they had adopted Raquel Rolnik's model of consultation. Anyways, I think it's my friend here, Eric, is going to take over and also talk a little bit more about this historic tour that took place. So.
Thanks. So Brittany told you a little bit about what happened in 2009, this historic tour, and in fact, it happened in October and November of 2009, but this organizing process, these 70 organizations all across the country coming together, it took all of 2009 to bring this mission together. But what I want to talk about is the legacy, what's happened since then. Immediately after the visit, Raquel prepared a report, as Rob said, over 30 pages of analysis, dozens of recommendations, covering the full range of issues issues of housing policy, its discriminatory history, segregation, cuts to public housing, cuts to Section 8, demolitions of public housing, expiration of Section 8 contracts, the foreclosure crisis, affordable rental crisis, homelessness, overcrowding, habitability, in conditions in Indian housing, the full gamut of housing issues. If you are a housing activist in the US, there's something in this report for you. She noted that a quarter of rental households were spending more than half their income on rent, a number that has only gone up since the report, and that puts millions of American families just one paycheck away from homelessness, one medical incident away from homelessness. She notes that 2/3 of the public housing units include either an older person or a person with disabilities. As President Obama in the debates, was talking about how the so-called 47% aren't people who are simply lazy. It's grandmothers, it's people living with disabilities who can't work, and we as a society have an obligation to them that isn't being met. She points out that since the early 1980s, the funding for public housing and housing subsidies has been slashed by 2/3, but in the meantime, each year, the federal government spends more than 3 times as much on tax breaks for high-income homeowners, with a large share of their tax breaks going to the highest income brackets because they get to take a mortgage income tax deduction on the first $1 million worth of their first 2 homes. That's who, if you live in a house that you own in this country, you live in subsidized housing, but we don't think about it that way. And those, there's never a debate about cutting the benefit to the upper income folks, but every year when the HUD budget comes up, it's always on the chopping block. And that 8% cut that's looming as part of the budget sequestration agreement, that's not going to apply to that tax break on the mortgage income tax deduction, but it will apply to the people at the lowest end of the spectrum. And she notes that as a result of this, the whole system is breaking down, and people are experiencing homelessness in record numbers in this country. But rather than providing shelter or adequate housing, many communities are trying to sweep the problem under the rug and sweep it out of public view by criminalizing the very existence of people living on the streets, making it illegal to sleep, to eat, to sit on the streets, and even criminalizing the act of sharing food with homeless people. She called for the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness and Department of Justice to issue a report on constructive alternatives to the criminalization of homelessness, which together with our advocacy in D.C., they actually did just this past year. And as a result of this advocacy, as a result of Raquel's report, it included an unprecedented statement that criminalization of homelessness may not just impact our constitutional obligations, but it may violate our human rights treaty obligations. Never before in our country's history has any domestic agency ever said any domestic practice might violate our international human rights obligations. We are literally changing the way our government talks about housing and homelessness, and that is the legacy that Raquel helped start with her visit. She also left this legacy of these 70 organizations all across the country who had been trained, educated in the human rights framework, and were ready to go out there and do something with it. In 2010, we did have a series of consultations that were slightly more than consultations, leading up to the Universal Periodic Review process at the UN. This is a process that every country in the world undergoes every 4 years, and this was the US's first time up before the Human Rights Council, and they held consultations in a dozen cities across the country. At the end of those consultations, when asked what was the #1 issue brought to them by the communities across the country, the State Department was unambiguous. They said housing. It was the #1 issue in every city that was brought up, and that was because we had a cadre of organized, educated activists ready to bring that mission, bring that framework to their issues and apply it at this level. And as a result of that consultation process, it gave us a chance to have another bite at the recommendations from Raquel's report. All the recommendations were part of the record that goes to the Human Rights Council as part of the Universal Periodic Review process, and we got the council to echo some of the recommendations. One of them that was particular importance to us was the ability for ex-offenders to be able to access public housing resources. There's millions of prisoners who are coming out of the prison system every year who have a criminal record, don't have an easy time getting a job with a criminal record, and yet they're denied housing resources, public housing resources, as a result of their convictions. And they have nowhere to turn, no job, no housing. What are they going to do but return to criminal activity in order to support themselves? We brought this concern to HUD following the consultation process, and as a result of our meetings with them, as a result of Raquel's recommendation, as a result of the UPR recommendations, we got a letter from HUD Secretary Donovan to every single public housing agency in the country recommending that they give the full discretion of their ability to incorporate people with criminal records into public housing. There's only a very limited number of people who are actually banned as a result of their convictions, but many public housing agencies were taking a much wider discretionary approach. And the letter that he sent out, it didn't use the word human rights, but it talks about the humanity of these people. It talks about many things that show that he was coming from a human rights perspective as a result of the advocacy that we had done. She's also laid the groundwork for subsequent visits of other special rapporteurs. We had the special rapporteur on water and sanitation here last year, and she met with a number of groups out in California who are being criminalized as a part of their homelessness, where the city of Sacramento is actually denying, closing down bathrooms and closing down public drinking fountains in a lot of areas to force homeless people out of the public parks there. Those activists who were there had submitted video testimony to the rapporteur that she heard at the National Forum on the Human Right to Housing in DC. And they were ready for this other special rapporteur to actually come and visit them in Sacramento. And as a result of that, they got a huge amount of media attention, have really turned the political tables in Sacramento, and are getting a lot more traction on their work to establish a safe ground, a safe place where homeless people can exist without being harassed. So all of these things are part of the rapporteur's legacy. And we are using these recommendations today. If you're a housing activist and you aren't familiar with this report, or with these organizations that are out there and using these recommendations, you need to get in touch with them, because this is part of this tremendous legacy that Raquel has left us with. We're so grateful for her work. We're so grateful for this new report on the financialization of the housing crisis, and it's up to us as activists to make this the right to housing a reality for ourselves here in the U.S. using these tools and these allies that we have. So I think we both want to close by saying, that we are available. There's lots of other organizations available to help you and to be in touch with us, and we will do it all together.
I just want to add a comment. Because I just see as the real legacy that Raquel left here was a seed of resistance, which was bringing us together in that network, and I know that many of us have put forth tremendous efforts to continue the collective work, and we're certainly not done, and it hasn't been easy, but we know that it's needed, and we know that it's needed largely because of this 2009 opportunity to see what was happening in all these different locations, and the scale of the problem, the dimensions and the different components of the crisis is it just would be it's necessary for us to work together, and these decisions are being being made on every level of government. So it's, and the community needs to be central to all of those decisions. And so we have much more work to do, and we need to keep working, trying to work together, keep building on the efforts of the last few years. And Nesri is eager to talk to anybody in the room. I know we have Rob, and now we have Tanaka, our incoming housing director, and we would just be very excited to talk about those next steps. So, thank you.
So we're about to move to the focal point of our program, but before we move there, I want to, again, as I said, stories generate what I do. So in 2010, I had the opportunity in late March to go to the World Urban Forum in Brazil. I went as a member of the Campaign to Restore National Housing Rights. I was there with Tiffany Gardner, the former Human Right to Housing Director, Becky Dennison, who is an organizer with the Los Angeles Community Action Network, and Sam Jackson from Mayday New Orleans. And it was a wonderful experience, but I want to tell you about a particular experience. Raquel brought us down, and we didn't have much time to spend together. We got down there on a Sunday, and Raquel wanted to take us out sightseeing, so she took us to a mountain range called, where there's one of the 7 wonders of the world, which is a big statue of Christ, and it's the highest peak in Brazil. And we spent an afternoon up there, and it was really a breathtaking view overlooking the city. And she whispered in my ear that he's watching over the city, and it was just an impressive sight that afternoon. But on the way down, we had a little bit of trouble getting down because Raquel hadn't been up there in a while and didn't realize the process of engaging somebody to get us back down for them. We got up there, now how do you get down, right? So she finally found us a ride down, and Raquel and I are sitting in the front seat of this van, and she said something to me that I will take with me the rest of my life. She said to me, we're sitting in the front seat together, and she goes, Rob, when I first took this visit, I thought I was crazy. When I heard that, to take this U.S. mission, I said to myself, what, are you crazy? She said, and then I came to the U.S., and the way you guys organized that mission was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. So, Raquel, I thank you for that statement. It's something I will always remember. But the other thing that I'll always remember is the effect of that mission at the Nesri interns. It was a huge role that interns play in this, and part of what we're doing here today involves me bringing different sectors of the community together to help with this process. And Hannah Person, who is working the slideshow here for me, is a former Nesri intern, but interns play roles in many different ways. And we don't only have interns here in the U.S., there are interns in Brazil, right? And Raquel, I'm sure you've had interns before. And imagine my surprise when I sat here about a month ago in the Grad Center, and I was watching a program that was related to Brazil, and I started having a conversation with the person facilitating that particular event, and I mentioned that I'm doing this event here October the 26th, and that person told me he knew Raquel. So I said, yeah, and then when I found out the story, I said, that's pretty incredible. So I'm going to take this opportunity to invite a former intern to Raquel Rolnik to bring Raquel Rolnik up on the stage for her report. I'd like to bring Alessandro Angelini up to the stage, who served as an intern with Raquel back in 2002.
Surprise. Hi, everyone. It's true. I'm Alessandro Angelini. I'm actually a PhD candidate here at the Graduate Center in anthropology. I'm also an instructor now in the Design and Urban Ecologies program at the New School that just started this year. All right. Yep. So as a little surprise, Rob, asked me to introduce Raquel, but for me it's just simply a great honor and a chance to express gratitude that's long overdue for almost a decade now. Because in 2002 I was a college graduate from New York, and I'd just been accepted into a master's program in London. And I came to work over the summer, or Brazilian winter, as an intern in Raquel's research team at the Polis Institute in São Paulo. I even lived across the street from the Institute in the city's loud, bustling historic center, and I just couldn't resist exploring it on my own, and very soon the seemingly endless, undifferentiated sprawl of São Paulo started to reveal its variegated spaces to me, and as well as its stark contradictions, the unemployment line and the shiny financial bank towers, the graffiti scripts covering the facades of squatted buildings, the favelas packed up against the securitized fortresses of deluxe condominiums. So at Polis, Raquel showed me how on-the-ground urban research could build into policies that promoted social justice. She was absolutely tireless, as she is today, and her colleagues and assistants were inspired every day by her energy. It was contagious. She put me to work from day one, from the first morning. I didn't have time to get over the jet lag, and my first job was to edit an English translation of the city statute, which was a federal law that came into effect in 2001 that addressed deep social and spatial divisions that characterize Brazilian cities. And for those unfamiliar with the city statute, it's an instrument for urban development with two basic functions. First was to ensure the social function of urban land and buildings before their commercial value, and second, to ensure the democratic city management through social control and participation. So during my time with Raquel, we also devised a city statute board game, which stuck with me when I was thinking of what to say today, because this was a game where players would assume the roles of different urban stakeholders. And this made an enormous impression on me because Raquel and her team perceived the need to make law itself something that ordinary people could use and should use and define in their everyday life. And so in other words, gameplay in that little experiment was to be a method to bring law into the lived reality by means of virtual and collaborative means. And this notion actually reappeared in my dissertation work on role-playing games, a game played by a favela youth collective in Rio de Janeiro, which we presented in this room about a month ago, as Rob mentioned. So Raquel, your intellectual and ethical imprint has stayed with me indelibly, and I'm just thrilled to present Raquel Rolnik today, and in a way, welcoming Raquel is a long overdue return favor that I've owed her for a long time. So thank you, and please help me in welcoming Raquel.
Oh my God. So first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. This is not just the presentation of a report. As you can see and understand, this is much more. It's trying to connect all the links between activism, social movement, change, and thinking on housing and housing right. This is what is the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the right to housing all about, at least the way I see it. And of course, I want to thank you very, very much, not only for the Graduate Center, NESRI, and all the organizations that were involved in this event, which I think it's much more important than present the report that you can read. It's in the website, it's public. Here the idea is much more to discuss it, to connect it to the things that are going on here. And when we started, when I sent an email to friends here in New York saying, I'm going to come to present the report. I think it would be great if we were able to discuss it. And Neil Smith was the first one to reply immediately saying, yes, let's organize something at the center. So I'm very, very proud that we could also do this tribute to Neil today. This is part of his energy. But let's present the report. I think it's. I want to show here something which has been worked, and it started indeed in the mission in the U.S. reflecting on what was going on with the foreclosure crisis. But then, if I build on Brittany's words and also Eric's saying how much we are talking about a national, very diverse and heterogeneous crisis related to housing, what I will argue here is that we are talking about a global crisis, housing crisis, a global trend. And I had the opportunity, the way the mandate is organized, we have to do country missions, 2 country missions a year. And after the mission in the US, I had the opportunity to do a mission in Kazakhstan, and I had the opportunity to do a working visit in Spain, and I had an opportunity to do a mission in Israel and the OPT, and in many, many other places, I could see signs, tips of a huge iceberg. And the iceberg, or the elephant, or what we can call it, it now has a name. And I am very happy to see Manuel Albers here, sitting here in this event, because he provided me with the name. Is the financialization of housing. This is the name. So I'm going to talk about financialization of housing, and financialization of housing as the common trend that links together such different things as a hunger strike of people who had paid for their installments for their new apartment home, and the construction companies were simply bankrupt and the apartments are not there. Same in St. Petersburg, where I met. It's the same name that links that with the people that were camping in the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem the summer before, asking and talking about affordability and a housing crisis. And it's the trend that has to do with the people who are today living in Chile or Mexico in massively produced by the market homes, los con techo, which are suffering from living in very inadequate conditions produced by private market as a success story to be reproduced everywhere. So we can see those links, and I think it's very important to understand that, to understand the millions of indebted or foreclosured homeowners, the subprime victims of a decade of credit booms, but also the millions of vacant houses in China, in Mexico, in the US, and the rising numbers. I think we can talk about the millions of new homeless. We have a new generation of homeless in those same country. So it's not surprisingly that the first sector to be deeply hit by the crisis was housing, because fed by pension funds, private equities, hedge funds, and other fictitious commodities, housing became a fictitious commodity itself when it was taken over by finance. So this is the point, is the taken over by the housing sector by finance. How much that was important to finance to expand its territorial influence, and how much it changed completely the paradigm that different countries adopted as the prevalent housing policy or the prevalent housing strategy. Housing has been of the most powerful new frontier of late neoliberalism during the decades of economic boom and was converted from the beginning of the crisis into one, and this is the paradox, into one of the main Keynesian strategies to recover from it. What is going on in Brazil right now to produce and to promote credit for home ownership as a measure to prevent the economic crisis to come is exactly to the type of reply, of responses that we are having to this crisis. So I think it's the power of neoliberalism, exactly that, and I'm using Albert's words. It furthers its agenda in economic boom periods as well as in economic bust periods, which are the period we are now. So backed by the political force of home ownership ideology, deeply rooted in some society and recently adopted in others, and by socialization of the so-called socialization of credit, which means let's make credit available to all, then everybody will get an adequate housing to live. That's the mantra, that's the policy, and that had been translated into different types of intervention, but always with the same idea. The movement I have just described has been the socialization of credit, with inclusion of middle and low-income consumers into financial circuits, the taking over of the housing sector by global finance, open a new frontier for capital accumulation. And this, I think, is very important, and it goes as far as the worst slums in Africa, in African and Asian cities, who also became bankable. So microfinance is, I would say, the last frontier of bringing finance to the poor, to the poorest among the poor, and we're going to see the consequences. Of course, in '93, a World Bank very influential report that it's called Housing Enabling Markets to Work, summarized the new thinking on housing policies. The report contained not only extensive arguments on how potent could be the housing sector for the economy, but also guidelines for governments on how to best design policies to achieve this goal. From that point on, international financial agencies was very responsible on trying to, by providing technical assistance to different governments around the world, to promote housing finance sector reforms, to promote this type of policies and to spread out this paradigm shift around the world, and we can see it really as a model, the commodification of housing as a first step, but then the transformation of housing into a financial assets. So private housing markets as the primary mechanism for allocating housing solutions. So the foreign assistance from international organizations influenced the agenda, and they boost housing markets activity in developing countries, and in developed countries and that was done in many different ways. So in most countries, by promoting individual ownership as the main model of allocating housing, and that came together with the privatization of social housing programs and social housing stock. So that's more or less what happened in the US or Canada and in several countries in Europe, like the UK, it's a good example, selling the tenant to tenants the houses where they live, the public housing, the so-called council housing in the UK to their tenants, the right to buy policies, or more radically, the demolition of public housing and the cuts in the programs to build new public housing that was absolutely vanishing all over. but in another strategy also deregulating housing finance markets. So that happened massively in former planned economies. So in former communist countries, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was a common trend, the massive privatization of public housing that exists in those countries. So you can see today 96% of Estonia housing stock is privately owned, 77% of Slovenia, 80% of Chinese housing stock is privately owned. So it was basically either sold or given, or stolen, or taken over by either the people that were there, or in cases that you can see, it's incredible. And I have to tell you this story. I was in a seminar in Prague on Roma and their housing issues, and then here comes a person, and he told us that he owns 3,500 housing units. His company owns 3,500 housing units from Bulgaria. Bulgaria, you say Bulgaria? Bulgaria. Then, and I said, how come you own 3,500 housing units? And part of it which had Roma communities living in. And I mean, very easy. A big metalworks industry that was state industry was privatized. And when the industry was privatized, the industry had 3,500 units for the workers. And he became the owner of the housing state as well, not only of the factory. So part of this process of privatization had also this type of issues. At the same time, we had the housing finance, which is critical to the development of the financial sector and a central pillar of the financial market, expanding the terrain for global capital. So a combination of deregulation, liberalization, plus internationalization of finances, that brings and opens the ground for today. What we have, mortgage funds for mortgage lending are, and of course it depends from country to country, pretty much internationalized, which means that mortgage funds and the financial system involved in promoting credit and mortgage to different population in different countries, they are made of different small chunks of international capital from many, many countries in a way that everything is absolutely interrelated. But not only that, that meant that for those who were at the national level, had to compete in terms of capacity of paying and capacity of being in the market with international global capital and not domestic savings. So part of the issues of affordability that we are living now, you can see, for instance, from 1997 to 2004, we had a rise of 150% in housing prices in Spain, 140% in the UK, 190% in Ireland, 227% in South Africa. We are talking about a global market, which is organized and structured by global prices of international capital and have nothing to do with local people, because local people are earning local wages local incomes, local rents, local economic activities. So this gap, this huge gap, is part of the problem of affordability that happened in many, many, many countries. So housing markets were regulated, indeed deregulated, so as to promote the financial rather than the social aspects of housing. Housing is not important. Housing is just, I would say, a bedrock for the finance to come and go. And that's it. The fact that it's somebody living there, the fact that it's home for people, it's not important at all. Market-based housing finance has contributed to a widespread bubble. That's exactly what I said. And that was combined, and this is very important, it's not only the promotion or credit and mortgage as a means to home ownership for lower and middle and lower income people, but also the erosion, the neglect, and the liberalization of any non-market mechanisms that existed in housing. So, cutting the HUD budget decreased from 83 billion in 78 to 18 billion in 93, and then zero from 96 to 2001, the budget to build public housing. This was a common trend. In many, many countries we see just basically that any other option rather than embarking on a debt to buy your own home through different types of credit schemes, including subprime, became the only option. No rent, no protected rent, no public housing, no rental housing, no cooperative housing. Everything was dismantled more and more. And rent and rental schemes, part of the reforms that the country is undertaking, this is very clear in the case of Spain, for instance, was making rent much more insecure and easier for landlords to kick off the tenants. So the thing is, the whole machinery function in these two ways, offering credit in one hand and the other hand dismantling, simply dismantling any other options. And you know very well the story, stigmatizing public housing and its inhabitants as dependents of welfare. And this is not only the US, you can see that in Europe very, very clearly. And that was very important part of the machinery that brought together, the ideological machinery that brought together that public housing, non-market housing, is the place for losers. Winners have their little home in the suburbs, or not the suburbs, mostly in the suburbs. Because in the central cities, it's too expensive. So there are many, many different policies, but in the report, I dealt mainly with three types, because I think, although they are very different in nature, they are very interconnected. One is mortgages lending to low income. The second one is capital subsidies to support entry into housing credit. And the third one, as I referred, is microfinance. I won't go very far on mortgage and subprime, because you know here very well, and there are a lot of people in this room that have written about, have talked about that, what happened here in this country with the subprime. But basically, the type of subprime credit here, which is not only in the case of the US, have to do with credit to households which were not in principle eligible for loans. And that impacted disproportionately on the most vulnerable, and in a very discriminatory way. Because, I mean, this is basically what we call redlining. Red line, it's very common in the US, red line in the real estate market. So the places where values are low because the people who live there are not valuable. So when the bank approaches somebody who is in this district, the interest that this person must pay is much higher just because it is in a certain circle. So with the new credits, it's exactly like that. The most vulnerable you are, the poorer you are, the more interest you pay to the bank, because the risk that the bank has that you won't pay back is higher. So we are exposing exactly the most vulnerable, the weakest, to the worst risks and the worst exploitation by finance. And that's exactly what happened here. And not only that, if we take another version of the same issue in Eastern Europe, a high rate of foreign currency denomination of the mortgage because of the international markets. So what happened in the Eastern Europe now is that people took loans in Swiss francs. But now the currency exchange changed completely, so they have to pay much, much, much more than they have expected. And then the responses to the crisis on this level are basically more of the same. Tightening more mortgage markets, asking more high interest rates, more public cuts in the funding for non-market alternatives, like in Greece or Spain, homelessness, indebtedness, and the worsening of housing conditions. The second very important trend is the demand subsidies. The subsidies part of the financial strategy to promote housing. So it's again the same, with the same idea of approaching credit to people, to low income, to middle income, who are not eligible to credit before. There are different measures of direct payment upfront, or subsidies tied to savings, or interest rate subsidies, tax subsidies. So interest rates subsidies and tax subsidies, as was mentioned here, was very traditional way of putting public money to middle and upper income families through credit, and this is very, very clear. And the funny thing is that the whole discourse is that let's have the state out of the housing business. Let's not have state money involved in housing, but tax exemptions are exactly a lot of money involved in housing. But a different model that was used, and Chile and South Africa are good examples, are money from public funds, from budget, that is given to low-income families to help them buy a product which is offered by the private market as homeowner. And that has been told everywhere as the success stories of being possible for low-income people to buy the homes produced by the private market. But, I mean, it's a complex, and we don't have time to develop all that, but it's all that in the report. But basically, what the problems that we had with this type of thing is that in this model, the subsidies in an unregulated market went directly to the price of land. And first of all, the land that was acquired by private entrepreneurs to promote housing was always land without right to the city without access to the city, in the outskirts with no jobs, with no economic opportunities. So what we have now, and I have done a working visit in Chile, is in the southern part of Santiago, for instance, thousands and thousands and thousands of small homes inhabited only by poor people, low-income people, no jobs, no economic activities, no social diversity. Exactly what was criticized as being the main problems of housing projects and public projects, but in a much larger scale. Very segregated. I mean, it had absolutely segregated the city, and a lot of social problems going on. And now what including Chilean government is doing is starting to demolish some of those privately built projects in the southern Chile. So what is the conclusion in this case? And it's amazing, Mexico has imitated the program. Brazil is doing exactly the same thing now, and it's spreading, including in Chavez, Venezuela. More or less the same model, and in many other countries in Africa. So basically what we have here is that the only issue that matters in this type of housing policy is affordability. People are able to pay, yes, but the product that they are buying, it's not adequate housing. The only aspect of adequate housing which is there is affordability, but location, availability of infrastructure, access to work, and all the elements of the right to adequate housing, non-discrimination, are not there. And in a context of housing deficit, beneficiaries of housing subsidies simply buy what is available at the moment. So the question here, again, nobody has other option than buying what is offered by the market, and what is offered by the market is not adequate at all. And finally, housing microfinance, bankable slums at the last frontier of finance, because of course slum dwellers have not, never would thought of being a very good client for financial products because of that not formal employment, the irregularity of income, very small loans amounts, and very high transaction costs to deal with these loans. But now became more and more also we have financial products for slum dwellers, including small amounts of money for housing amelioration for slum dwellers, and we have that in Central America a lot, and in some places in Africa and Asia. But again, of course, those has huge interest rates. I can give you the example of 70% interest rate that is practiced by Compartamos Banco in Mexico for the slum dwellers that take loans of $100, $200, $300 to promote amelioration in their homes. And again, of course, indeed, people are able to build a toilet or to better the roof with this money, which is meaningful. But, we are talking about those type of mechanisms replacing housing policies at all. So the issue of security of tenure, the issue of the infrastructure of the settlement, the issue of the public space, of schools are not there. And often we see people that took the loans, have better houses, and then right after that are evicted to other places. So, of course, this is not a response to housing. So, as a conclusion, I would say finance is discriminatory in essence. And discrimination is one of the gross violations of human rights. And so it's just impossible to provide adequate housing for the poor, the vulnerable, the low income, using finances. So this is one lesson learned. And if it's not, then we have other issues as segregation and security of tenure. Because again, finally, one thing that was being considered ideologically and culturally as the most secure form of tenure, which is home ownership, because of foreclosures, you can see that there is no security of tenure for homeowners anymore. No security of tenure for tenants. So we are really, really facing a housing crisis. And of course, the reducing of state expenditures is a big lie. It's not only a big lie because of tax exemptions, subsidies, and all that were used to promote housing finance, but now because of bailouts and the huge amount of money that is going to the banks. So, my final question here: does the deep economic crisis that swept the world after 2007 draw the final limits of neoliberalism and its translation in housing policies? I think apparently, and especially during the first months of the debacle precipitated by US subprime crisis in 2008, the financial crisis has been considered an expression, and I'm quoting Neil Smith, of toxic liberalism as compared with a supposedly healthy one. But the idea that the market would get back to his feet, of course, after many years, we can see that this is not true. This is not true. And the housing crisis is getting worse and worse. But at the same time, we don't see a paradigm shift. We don't see really a new trend coming out, so the retaking of housing as a public policy. But I think that the reaction of the dispossessed, including those in danger of losing their living spaces, began to be seen in different parts of the world. I would say Zuccotti Park in New York and other Occupy movements, Plaza del Sol in Madrid, they have a lot of common trends and common issues. They are symbolic reappropriation of public space. They are reaffirming the existence of public as concerned to issues of governments and social justice and policies, and I'm quoting here Peter Marcuse. And I think that this opens the ground for us to reaffirm housing as one of these public goods, social goods, commons that a society must have in order to be called a society. Thank you. How much? Okay.
So can we get another round of applause for Raquel Rolnik, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing? I've been telling you guys for a long time that I'm blessed to be doing this work, and it's people like Raquel that just really help, and the word comes up again, echoes our voices, really lift us up from the ground, and really get our message out there. So Raquel, I personally want to thank you for all that you've done. I want to invite the speakers up to the stage, Tom Ngati, Shani Jamila, Letitia James. Can you guys come up to the stage, please?
Right, no?
And Dr. William Pepper, please. So as I said, I want to get away from a little bit of a theme when I do this stuff, or getting away from written text. Everybody up on this stage that just came up here, I have somewhat of a relationship with. So I'm going to start with Dr. William Pepper. The relationship is just starting to form, but Frank Morales, who many of you know I speak about publicly, has really given me an education on the work on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and some of the things that have gone on as far as squatting and in the housing movement. I get my orientation in history from Frank, and he's the one that has connected me to Dr. William Pepper, and I'm honored to have Dr. William Pepper here. And I circulated information that's saying he was personal counsel to Dr. Martin Luther King, but it was to the King family that he was personal counsel, and Dr. Pepper will tell you more about his work with Dr. King. Tom and Gotti, with Dr. King's family. Tom and Gotti is where my orientation in Take Back the Land learned about land trusts. Every day I have the opportunity to connect with Tom and Gotti if I want in a real way and get an education about land trust and communal land ownership as a model. Tom has been teaching urban planning at Hunter for some time now, and both Max Rameau, my co-founder at Take Back the Land, and I have really engaged Tom a lot, and I've also worked with Tom in the Right to the City Alliance. The rapporteur, I don't even have to honor, but Tish James is up on the stage, and she is a council member that I first started working with at Picture the Homeless, as I was a member of Picture the Homeless, and we got the opportunity, I believe it was in 2008 or 2009, the Black and Asian and Latino caucus of the City Council wanted to engage community groups in their work and connect with them in a real way, and they got different groups to come to an initial meeting with her and Melissa Mark Viverito, a council member from East Harlem, and we started explaining our work, and as we explained ourselves, I never forget Tish James pointing across and saying, I want to work with them, meaning the people from Picture the Homeless. She loved our presentation, and I've stood side by side with Tish James, and she was fighting the good fight in Brooklyn against the development downtown, and we struggled quite a bit, but we stood up till the end at Freddy's, and one Saturday morning, we all came out together and stood side by side, so I've been into the trenches with Tish James, and I really appreciate her work as a council member. Shani Jamila is an up-and-coming rising star at the Urban Justice Center. She took over for somebody I just had an old schoolboy crush on at the Urban Justice Center. Many of you know I was working with Asian DK for a long time, and as we started to put this together, I asked everybody for a bio on the panel, and Shani sent me a picture, and obviously from that picture that I got emailed to me, I'm going to start forming a new schoolboy crush with the new executive director of the Urban Justice Center. So Shani Jamila will moderate our panel today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shani and say thank you.
Well, I love that introduction. Thank you so much, Rob, not only for your kind words, but also for all the organization, all the time, all the dedication that I saw that you put into organizing today's event. It really is fantastic. And can we just give a round of applause to Rob Robinson to acknowledge his work and efforts for this? I also want to thank each one of you for joining us on this panel, and our special rapporteur. I'd also like to ask for a special round of applause for her as well. That was a fantastic presentation. Lastly, before I begin with the questions, I'd like to publicly acknowledge Joanne Camaford and Brittany Scott, whose thoughts are going to help mold this discussion that we had today. So thank you all. Thank you, ladies, very much. And I guess what I'd like to ask each one of you to do, just to begin, is for your immediate reactions to the presentation that we just heard. And also, if you can talk a little bit about what your thoughts are about the counter-narrative that needs to emerge amongst people who want to work for housing as a human right for all of us in order to combat all of the different things that have led to what we've just heard described as the financialization of the housing crisis. So perhaps, Tish, we can start with you.
Sure. Thank you. So first, let me thank you for inviting me, and My remarks will be rather brief. As I was listening to the presentation, I just thought about my ride over here. I represent Ingersoll, Whitman, and Farragut Public Housing. And whenever I come to the city, I drive by the public housing. Over 50% of the individuals in the public housing are unemployed. There's a significant number of social problems in the public housing. When you pass the public housing, you can't but drive by and see all of downtown Brooklyn and all of the investment that this government and others have invested in downtown Brooklyn, and you see the two contrasts. And you see these tall, shiny, wonderful buildings, you see all of this investment, and you see the public housing, which is isolated, which is desolate, where the benches, unfortunately, have been ignored for far too long. And you see this contrast continues to bother me and continues to be the reason for my struggle and my commitment to social justice, and a cry and a campaign that I continue to launch in city government about how we can do better as a society, how we put all of our investment in downtown Brooklyn, attracting individuals from the suburbs back to the city. And here you have thousands of individuals who are struggling to survive, who struggle under the weight of poverty, decent, hardworking individuals, and they are ignored. They are ignored constantly by this administration. And the plight of poverty overwhelms them, and there's no one who focuses on their issues. And then I come here today and I hear this presentation, and I think about all of the public housing that has been demolished in Newark, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in Chicago. And I wonder what is going to happen to the constituents of Ingersoll, Whitman, and Farragut, and all the other public housing in New York City. I think about Prospect Gardens, I think it's Prospect Gardens, in Brownsville, which are two buildings that are ghost towns, which lie as symbols, unfortunately, of government neglect. And there's plans to demolish those two buildings and replace them. And I wonder what is the future of public housing? And I recognize that housing is an economic engine in this city, and housing is to New York City as oil is to Texas.
Real estate, yeah.
And it's all about real estate in this city, and how we really need to reform our housing policies in the city of New York, in the state of New York, and that in Congress, as housing financing measures unfortunately languish, there's not an effort in this city, in this state, focusing on low-income individuals and our people struggling under the weight of poverty. In fact, most people in government, except for a few, ever mention the word poverty. And yet tonight, more children will go to bed hungry, will go to sleep in shelters in the city of New York, the richest city in this country. But they're really mentioned in public discourse. And so I just thank you for your presentation. I thank you for this opportunity to talk to all of you. I see all of you out here really believe in change and really believe that we can do better in this city and in this country. And that as we move forward in the next administration, how it's really critically important, both on the federal level and on a local level, we have to change the metrics and the formulas and the policies going forward.
Yes, let's go on down the line.
Well, I'm overwhelmed by the breadth and the depth of the study that Raquel has done, and I am flabbergasted by the fact that you would never see anything like that here. First of all, American exceptionalism doesn't allow Americans to think about a global system. You know, that what's happening here is happening all over the world, and the negative impacts here are happening all over the world. So the other thing that I have to congratulate Raquel on is that it's participatory research in a way that I've rarely seen. Our center did a participatory study with Picture the Homeless on vacancies in New York City, but the usual way of doing research by the academic entrepreneurs is to go out and look for a grant from a foundation and study the question, looking at both sides of the picture. And invariably the conclusions always come out that there has to be a solution that involves triggering the market again. So and this is the view held in Washington by Republicans and Democrats, by the current administration, that the housing collapse was a temporary event, and the solution is simply to get us back to where and to prime the pump so that we can get back to over 70% of the population being homeowners, and perhaps even more, because the continuous national policy of all of administrations in the last 50 years has been to solve the housing problem by making everybody a homeowner. And we saw how whether you own your own home or whether you rent it is really secondary. The real question is, do you have a right to housing? And so I guess I was thinking back too of earlier campaigns among the housing movement, the tenant movement in New York City that I was involved in the 1970s. We had a campaign to get the banks out of housing. And that was actually quite an uphill struggle. To make that connection, because people don't see the banks. They see the landlords. And they fight the landlords. But the landlords are as much the cogs in the wheel that's set up by a global financial system. And it is very much a part of who owns the land. Very often the landlords are only the people who are running the buildings. So this kind of deep knowledge of how this system works is so important for activism, because it's so easy to get lost targeting or mistargeting the source of the problems. And I think they have to be the people who are making public policy and who keep going back to this, these market solutions. And the real estate giants, the global real estate giants, and the local ones, because the global ones also have local partners. And so I thank Raquel for helping us to open up these discussions, and also hopefully will help us to understand better who our enemies are in New York City.
Yeah, good.
Thank you. Raquel, thank you for your work and your comprehensive report. Panel, and respect to all of the activist groups who, Nesri and others who have been in this fight for so long, and respect also to my legal colleagues who are here and who have devoted themselves to this issue, and Professor Marcuzzi and Professor Harvey for your long-standing contributions to these issues. The overriding problem of social, economic, and cultural human rights, which of course encompasses housing, is anathema to a capitalist society. I convened the seminar on international human rights at Oxford for 2 years before returning to the United States. And I could not find or come to grips with any adequate text material that dealt with social, economic, and cultural human rights. Because the whole focus in Western industrial society has been on civil and political rights. And I regard civil and political rights, I've come to regard them as an opiate that has failed drastically the masses of humanity. Mr. Roosevelt realized this at the end. In his final State of the Union address, he called for a new Bill of Rights, many of you know. And included in that new Bill of Rights was the right to shelter and the right to housing. His wife, Eleanor, continued that struggle after his death. Between 1947 and 51, she was the head of the American drafting team with respect to the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. And it went for those 4 years, and she fought gamely, ferociously against her enemies at home in the United States, who were determined that America would never, not only not sign the optional protocol, but America would never agree that social, economic, and cultural rights should be elevated to that position. So we are faced with that reality in this society. I met Martin King, only knew Martin King the last year of his life. I was a journalist in Vietnam. It was a horrific experience, and my photographs and writings on that war came to his attention, and he asked me to meet with him and open my files, and I did, and he wept. And we became close that last year, had many dialogues about the issues of human rights in the United States. And he was a liberal, gradually becoming radicalized. He gradually saw the interrelationship, as Rob mentioned earlier, the interrelationship, the interconnection of all human rights, civil, political, human, economic, social, and cultural. One of our friends from the Oglala Sioux was, of course, Russell Means, who has just died recently and who struggled for his segment of that indigenous population. Martin said to me at one point, he said, you know, what do you do? You're first generation American, baseball player, basketball player, scholarship kid at Trinity School, scholarship at Columbia, then LSE in London. Where did you get from, where'd you go, how'd you get lost? How'd you get out of your neighborhood and get into this other world? I had been in the South in the Civil Rights Movement and a number of their jails down there in the early 60s, but I never knew him. But he knew a bit of that, history that many students had and young people had. And I won't bore you with stories, but I took him back to when I was 12, and I was a baseball kid and a fanatic, and we couldn't play in our middle-class community, so I had to get on a trolley car with a little brown bag of sandwiches and go into the ghetto, because those kids played all day long. And so I came to play with them, but also eat my lunch in their house over the Neperhan Creek. And for the first time in my life, I saw rats running across a floor, and Herbie Fields throwing his shoe at those rats. I said, why do these wonderful people have to live like this? This was a 12 and 13-year-old. Years later, I became chairman of the Yonkers Citizens Union. I was quite young at the time and didn't know better. In 62, 63, we had a housing committee. And that housing committee went in every section of that fourth largest city of the state of New York. And for the first time, many of the members of that middle-class Citizens Union saw apartments that were shared 8 hours a day by 3 families and hammocks throughout the apartment. People had never seen that. Imagine that, living in a house 3 families, each having 8 hours of the day and then rotating depending on the time. So we issued this massive report in Yonkers, of course, but it was a
1 more minute, please.
typical two-party system that didn't work. And so the control was there. Housing, like all of the other social, economic, and cultural rights, has been commodified. But the commodification of housing is the commodification of human beings. The entire population have become just commodities. What to do about that? Martin King eventually agreed that always serious direct action was what was required, and that's what got him killed, because he was going to bring 500,000 people to Washington and camp in the shadow of the Washington Memorial and insist that social programs be refunded from funds that had been taken away by the war in Vietnam. The only thing that works really is direct action. I'm sorry, using the legal system is not going to work. 1 year I was director of the Commission on Human Rights.
Sorry, I'm going to need to interrupt.
Okay, the only way we could end it, housing discrimination, was to throw lines around the landlord's country club in his home in the suburbs. That's what will work. What will work now, in my view, with a number of others who are starting this movement here, is a change in the basic law of the United States. We have to go to the Constitution of the United States and embed these rights once and for all. And that will only happen when 1 million people come to Washington, camp there, do not go there, and effectively adopt a new constitution for this country, and then go back to the
Thank you very much,
States.
William. I appreciate it.
Sorry to go on. That's
And
all.
I'm sorry to have to cut you off. It's not that your analysis isn't brilliant. It's that we have about 10 minutes left for the rest of this panel.
Okay.
And so I'm going to ask each of you to keep your responses to the next few questions brief. And if time allows, if Rob doesn't kick us off the stage, we would like to open up the space.
Yeah.
I'm sorry? We do, okay. So I will just toss out a couple of quick questions then. Raquel, one of the things that I noted that came up in the responses, the immediate responses to your brilliant presentation, was that there was a notation that poverty is not being discussed. There was a remark that we haven't begun to enter into a global analysis as a country, and there's a note that we're commodifying people as we're commodifying our homes. We're at a very unique space in this country right now as we enter into this looming presidential election. All of these things, I think, have been noticeably absent from the debates and the discourse. What can we do at this particular historical juncture to move this debate forward and contextualize housing as a human right?
I don't know if I should have a optimistic or pessimistic reply to that. Yes. Again, quoting Neil Smith, neoliberalism is dead but dominant. Is dead. I mean, clearly had lost completely its capacity to present a proper response to what's going on. Clearly. But it's still dominant. It's still, and what I realize, seeing and making this research through the missions to do this report, is that incredible, the driving force, with the driving force of globalization, the combination of the collapse of socialism and communism, and the fact that this became the only and one ideology, and how much that was really embedded internationally, not only as a practice, but also as an ideology, and how much this is important politically for the governments. In one side, you see, this is very, very serious. It went very, very deep into everybody's souls in the structure. But at the same time, what we see all over, and not you are having an election here. We, in Brazil, we are having an election for mayors next Sunday. And what we could see, and you can see everywhere, nobody believes in those parties and in those guys who are presenting themselves to run countries, cities. Nobody really believes. I mean, we vote. How can we do? We have to vote. We do, we vote, we choose the less worse. That's what we do. But, I mean, the whole thing is falling apart. It's clearly, we are living, we are living through a very important crisis. And it's not just an economic or a financial crisis. Maybe it's a civilizatory crisis. Maybe it's something much more. The whole idea of Republican representation, the way politics is organized, it's in crisis. The environmental crisis is it's one of the main important signs of this crisis. So I think that when we live in times like that, it's very difficult to see a light at the end of the tunnel. It's very difficult to see, but I think it will come. And of course, echoing everybody's voices before me, it won't come by itself. We have to push.
Thank you. Tish, quickly, can I ask you, a lot of the policies that have been put in place that have created this crisis have happened both at the national level and at the international level. What role can local governments take in bringing a solution to this crisis?
So let me just say this, I continue to be drunk on hope. And I believe that as a result of what happened in Zuccotti Park, what happened in the Arab Spring, what happened in young people in my district and throughout Brooklyn with the Obama phenomenon. I continue to believe in hope, and I will always believe in hope because I have nothing else. And because when I look in the faces of the constituents that I represent, I've got to believe in hope, and I've got to believe that the body that I represent, the city council and the state legislature and politics in general, can be used as a force for good. So saying all of that, I'm looking forward to 2013, when the entire city of New York will be transformed, when the entire political structure will be changed. And so what we need are individuals who can take the mantle of the city of New York and who can believe in activism, agitation, and legislation as a goal to reform our policies. And I'm hoping all of you will join me as we shake up New York City, because the Gilded Era is coming to an end. And it's critically time that we stand up for people who have historically been ignored.
Thank you. That's worth a round of applause, right? And I'll pose one more question to Tom and William before opening it up to you for your questions. And that is, how can we learn from lessons in previous movements towards creating the other world that is possible in the world of the World Social Forum, and make sure that we don't replicate some of the existing disparities, particularly along the lines of race and gender, that are currently deeply embedded in the crisis?
Well, I like the phrase that Gore Vidal used, that he said this was the United States of amnesia. The United States folks don't really have much of a grasp on history. It's not really taught in the schools, and when it's taught, it's not the people's history. It's not Howard Zinn's history. It's the history of the great white men who sat around a room and signed a constitution that didn't include most of the working people in the country and women. So I think there's what we have to learn from the movements in the past is we have to study them, understand them. We have to talk to people who participated in them, and that doesn't go on. There's always, I think Occupy was a really good beginning to that, because in Zuccotti Square there were so many conversations, discussions, debates, bringing together people of different generations, and surprises that there was a labor movement in this country, that there was a civil rights movement. In fact, so many people blanked on what happened in the civil rights movement. But that's kind of the ideology that is people are taught. Here is that there's the present and the future, and there's no past. Look forward and don't stand on the shoulders of your elders. And I'm not asking for anybody to stand on my shoulder, but I'm saying it's really important to rediscover one key thing in the past of the struggles, and it's called solidarity. Because so many prescriptions for social change are based on individual advancement, or their unique ideas. Well, some of the best ideas are not new, and they're based on ideas that people can embrace across a broad spectrum. It's not going to be the next little Washington-funded scheme to solve the housing crisis. Not that maybe we shouldn't have some more of those, but that's not the solution. The solution is rediscovering solidarity in our people's struggles in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, going back to the labor movement, the abolitionists, every aspect of history that has been wiped out of our consciousness, so that people lose hope. Because that's how you lose hope, when you don't see that anybody else has been willing to struggle to solve the problems that you've got to deal with now.
Thank you so much. William.
I think the idea of coalition is essential, my friend here says, I think there's no question that we need to bring together broad groups with a whole variety of interests and bind together in a common movement. That was the whole purpose of the National Conference for New Politics that Martin King established back in 1967. Most of you probably don't know it existed. We had a convention in Chicago attended by over 5,000 delegates from every conceivable walk on political spectrum of life, from radical to liberal. The problem was, and you ask, what can we do now that and learn from the past? That movement was infiltrated. It was infiltrated by provocateurs, by informants, and it was destroyed because of that. I was executive director of the National Conference of New Politics, and I was passed a note over my shoulder as Martin was delivering the keynote address. He said, "Get him out of here after he speaks, or we'll take him hostage." This was the Black Caucus. "We'll take him hostage and embarrass him before the world." So infiltration is very important, and to keep in mind about these movements. Political assassination is a reality of political life throughout all of history. It will be used again and again and again. So the Occupy movement, when it was eschewing individual leaders as opposed to some kind of rotating horizontal leadership, is a very good idea, so they can't just target one person and get rid of that one person. The problem with Occupy is that its diversification is such that it may not be able to lift its head and unify in the kind of global scale that is really required to bring 7 lines of march from every section of this country, walking to Washington to occupy the nation's capital and to create a new basic law for the country. And that's the struggle, that's the challenge. And what my friend has mentioned here is the importance of solidarity, which is important now as it was in Poland, and that has to be built, and has to be built carefully.
Thank you so much. It's now time for us to open the floor to each one of you. I believe there are mics on either side, so perhaps if you would approach and direct your questions to the panel.
I'd like to know what the panel's thoughts are on a present problem. about housing in New York. And that is, many of you are aware of the fact that the state legislature, the mayor, ended the Advantage program. Yep. It allowed people in shelters to have a way out. And the Occupy movement, I've been down there, I work at BAI, so I've seen it firsthand. They're not exactly inclined to go and talk to state legislators or city council people in general, frankly, from my experience, based on being down there for 2 years watching what's going on. So I wanted to ask the city council person, what is going on in terms of this? Because the mayor made a ridiculous comment in August, as we all know, how pleasurable it is to be in shelters. And I'd like to know what exactly you all are thinking about, what ideas are going on concretely about this.
So as you know, the state decided to defund a program which subsidizes rents for the homeless or for individuals who are low income. It was called the Advantage program. The mayor of the state of New York decided to defund that, and as a result of that, we lost this federal matching, and the city basically said, we too are not going to subsidize this program anymore. As a result of that, 1,500 families lost a subsidy, and most of them now find themselves either in the shelter system or doubling and or tripling up with their family. In fact, there are 50,000 individuals who are in the shelter system this evening, and 20,000 of them are children, and most of them look like me. It comes really down to the fact that the federal government and the state of New York, unfortunately, have disinvested in low-income housing programs in the city and in the state. And so when you talk about a movement, yes, we need a movement. You talk about coalition building, yes, we need a coalition building. We need coalition building, but we really need to get back to basics, and that is recognizing that housing is a right, and recognizing that we can do better in the city of New York, and that if you believe that individuals should not have to live on our streets or on our shelters, or that children should not have to live in our shelters, all of us have got to lobby our government, both on the city, local, and the federal level, to change housing financing in this country and reform the system so that homelessness will be no more. I was one of the first individuals, along with members of the Progressive Caucus and members of the Black, Puerto Rican, and Asian caucus, to criticize the mayor. I am no shrinking violet. The mayor has criticized me and has attempted to not engage in political assassination, but what they do is character assassination through a political force known as the New York Post.
Thank you, Tish.
I'd like to direct this at Raquel Rolnik. First of all, thank you again for coming so many times, and thank you for developing such a compelling analysis and message that, in fact, we don't have a housing crisis, we have a financial crisis and a human rights crisis, and really articulating so compellingly the root cause of the range of housing problems. The question that I'd hope you can answer is, you've become engaged with efforts in so many parts of the world and observe them very closely firsthand. And just as housing efforts here, I'm sure, are still fragmented, despite the leap forward your visit gave us around unifying efforts, certainly housing efforts around the world are not connected with each other either, although you've identified a similar root cause. What advice might you have for advocates, activists, organizers in different parts of the world to build stronger strategic bridges across these borders in order to perhaps build a more global strategy to address the root cause of this crisis?
It's an excellent question. Thank you.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think that it's true that movements, if you see the Arab Spring, if you see the movements of hipotecados in Spain, especially in Catalonia, if you see the movement in different parts, they are completely country-oriented, and it's true. We have to analyze what happened with the effort that has been done at the global level to build up an international network, and a lot has been done. I remember building up the social forum as an international effort, Seattle, and what meant to face the whole economic system with a completely different view. But then, in a way, being part of the different social for many, many years, it lost momentum. It lost momentum, and it was sort of caught between a multiplicity of different agendas, with the quest, which I think it's absolutely right, to not build a centralized, hierarchized movement, which is very important because it's part of what people are really trying to build up, but at the same time having a lot of trouble to have a global network to really influence the world's agenda. And in a way, coming back each movement to its own country and its own agenda, and fighting back, struggling in each on one country. But I think that the fact, and I will advocate for something which was not my original route as a researcher, as an activist, human rights, but I think that the idea of economic social and economic rights, it's a good ground for unification of all those fights. I really agree on that. I think that the human rights, a human rights-based approach, can bridge different people and connect civil political rights with those economic, social, and cultural rights together in a unified platform to face that. Having said that, I think it's very important the experiences that are going on the ground. And I can say that the community land trusts, for instance, which is a very important thing in terms of the housing arena and housing platform directed to non-marketized, non-commodified, collective replies. So the experiments that are going on here and there are very important also to build alternatives, because it's not just a question of saying, no, we don't want housing finance anymore. Okay, what do we want? What do we want as a policy? So I think that all the cooperative, collective ownership, the commons, all the experiences that are going on this field are very important to really build on alternatives that can spread up all over.
It's appropriate, Dr. Rolnik, that you have the last word on this panel. I'd like to thank each one of you for your brilliance, for your commitment. It's been my honor to share the stage with you. And thanks again to the organizers of this event.
Thank you. I want to, before we close out, I want to acknowledge the person that just asked that last question. That is Kathy Albiza, the Executive Director of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. One of the people, and Kathy, stand up, because I don't get to do this too often. Stand up, don't fight. Kathy, stand up. Folks, tell Kathy to stand up, because I ain't going to quit till she stands up, all right? That is a woman solely responsible for getting me to, to use the human rights frame and to really understand it in a huge way. Her and Tiffany Gardner sort of corralled me together and just impressed upon me the importance of the human rights framework. So I need to acknowledge the people that are giving me this credit. And then I would also like to say, if I could ask Hannah to come up. Hannah's been assisting me through this presentation and change of presentation. Hannah is a former NESRI intern. You just switch the thank yous. Just to say that the role of women in the social justice movement has really been a focal point of the work that I do, because who is supporting me and who is out there in front and who's most directly affected are women, primarily women of color. So it's very important for me in the work that I do as an African-American male to make note of that publicly. So I thank Shani Jamila, I thank Tish James, I thank Dr. William Pepper, I thank Tom Ngati, but an incredible thank you to UN Special Rapporteur Raquel Rolnik, who continues to work with me, who continues to answer my questions, on a regular basis, who has engaged her staff in a real way to work with me. I can't thank you enough. Thank you to all the people that spoke and presented. I want to thank all the interns that were here and all the people that helped me put this panel together. Thank you and have a great weekend.
Hey, Rob, can we make space for one lady who might have a question? Do you want to answer a question? Because I think she's been waiting for
My apologies. Step forward, please. Dr. Kathy Samuels, come on. So a big part of what we did in 2009, setting up the public discourse and the public event where people got to testify in front of the rapporteur, Kathy Samuels is a big part of making that event happen. So, Ms. Samuels, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask this question. It's primarily for the council member. The issue of succession in public housing. And this has become a big problem because public housing has special rules outside of what everybody else does. We are trying to get a group together to address this because public housing, if you're not on the lease, they will put you out no matter what, whether you can afford to pay or whatever. And part of the problem is that when you go to the housing managers, a lot of times you get incorrect information. And then you have to deal with it in court, which if you don't have the money for an attorney, you're just out there. I've tried to talk to several council members about this, and they punt me to the Congress people. The Congress people punt me to the state people punt you wherever they punt you, maybe the federal people again and whatnot. And my thing is, why has there not been, you see this is a problem with your constituents. They're being thrown out into the street, then they go into homelessness, they go into shelters that the city has to pay $2,000 and $3,000 a month to maintain them. Yes. Whereas it might be $200 or $300 in public housing. Why hasn't there been a bigger outcry by the city council regarding this issue? Why has there not been a group formed regarding this issue? John Rhea now is trying to put market housing in public parking space area in public housing, or any little area he can squeeze it into on public housing land. And my thing is, you would not have a surgeon work on you if they did not know the specialty in terms of what they were going to do. You wouldn't have an internal medicine doctor work on you if you needed an orthopedist. How is it that John Rhea, who knew nothing about public housing, was able to get that job? This is ridiculous.
Have to give her a chance to answer.
I'm done. Thank you. Thank you.
So my name is Letitia James and not Michael Bloomberg. I don't appoint any city agencies. Mayor of the City of New York decided to appoint John Rhea. As you know, the day that he was appointed, I issued a statement and was very critical of him because he came from Wall Street and did not have a background in public housing. Second, yes, John Rhea is looking at underutilized parking spaces in NYCHA, looking at developing them, trying to create some revenue for NYCHA and recreational areas, and this is a concern particularly as it relates to the issue of privatization of public housing. But the good news is that this administration only has 14 months left. And so, as an attorney, I believe in litigation, and I also believe in delaying the mayor from doing any further damage to the city of New York, and have used it quite often, as you know. With regards to secession rights in the public housing that I represent, Ingersoll, Whitman, Farragut, and Atlantic Terminal, Lafayette Gardens thinks they belong to me, but they don't, but they will soon under redistricting. The issue of secession rights has been an issue over and over again. We in the city council did a hearing on it. We did 2 hearings on it. We also determined, unfortunately, we are preempted from doing any legislation with regards to public housing and secession rights. This is an issue, obviously, that we could have a discussion here at some point in time with some of the legal scholars who are here. It's something that I want to take on and look at, and I recognize that it is a major problem in the city of New York. And last but not least, with respect to Advantage and all these other issues, the budget of the city of New York is a document which reflects our priorities and our values as a society. And as going forward, I think all of our budgets in the city of New York should reflect our commitment to human rights and the struggle of mankind, because we are all inextricably tied to one another. Let's end on that note. Thank you. Peace.